welcome everybody. Matt Carpenter with College Aid Pro. And we've brought what we think are some of the industry's leading experts together. First and foremost, we've been kind of courting them over years to try to get them involved with our organization in some capacity, to try to put together a team which we're taking a stab with the data accuracy team that's open. We're open to suggestions. If anybody's got a sexier name, put it in the chat, please. But one thing we pride ourselves on is trying to have the most accurate projections possible when it comes to net costs for how much colleges are actually going to cost families. Are you going to get any need-based financial aid? How much? Are you going to get any scholarships? How much? And that piece in particular is a pretty ambitious goal. And we think we've had a great amount of success so far, but in ever evolving process, fluid process, it's a hard piece of the puzzle here. And as much as we kind of take pride in our expertise, you got to have more sets of eyeballs. So that's a part of why we've gone after these folks to try to put this team together to make sure we're getting as much feedback in real time as possible. So again, we're as accurate as we can possibly be in setting fair expectations in an ever-changing process here. And the other thing that I think a lot of our, I see we have a lot of attendees today, which is great to see, and some names we know, some new names, and I think folks that are in our community, our College Aid Pro community, something that we talked specifically a lot about yesterday on our biweekly roundtable was the fact that technically you could say a lot of us here are competitors. But this is such a big space, and there's so much opportunity, and there's so many families that need help every single year that this collaboration, I think, has raised the bar for each of us as a whole. So we're getting this great feedback in real time from all these different advisors and different families from all different parts of the country that is helping, I think, collectively, all of us get better, serve these families better, improve the software, etc. So, that's been a huge piece of it. The other thing that I want to kind of call attention to two other things before we introduce our guests and get some of their takes is, number one, I will put into the chat section a petition that I started, I guess, about a month ago now, but we're going to talk on some of the specifics of these FAFSA changes that are coming as of January 1st, 2022. There's some good things, but there's a few of these changes are going to be a major problem for an awful lot of people. There's a few of them that are going to be problematic, but the one that I kind of see as the most glaring, egregious challenge is the fact that now there's going to be no discounts for families that have siblings in college or more than one student in college at the same time. Okay, so for somebody with no familiarity with how this process works right now, if I'm a family that I'm a family of four, I make $100,000 collectively, we don't have much in the way of savings. The formula states that we can afford about $20,000 a year for college. That's our foundation. That's our starting point, which already is a little bit crazy, right? That's a pretty big number of before we're talking about taxes or anything like that, right? That's a big number. But the formula counts for families that family of four, if they have two students in school at once, basically the family contribution, as they call it, at least as of today, remains at $20,000, but is divided equally between the two students. So they're saying this household can come up with $20,000, and each student has a family contribution of about $20,000. That's going away in January 1st, 2022. So for that same example, this formula is now going to say, okay, this student pays $20,000, and now you have another student in school as well, whether they're twins or they're overlapping for a year or two. Well, we're not going to look at it as if they each get a discount because they're in the same household. Each of them can pay $20,000 a year for college. So for this family of $100,000, they can spend $40,000 a year for college. And again, that's the starting point. That doesn't mean that's all they're going to pay. So hopefully that kind of rough hypothetical illustration demonstrates the negative impact that this is going to have for so many families. And there's a few other ones that we'll probably get to today that I think are going to be super problematic, but that's number one. So I will put that in the chat. I really hope you'll, number one, sign that petition. And number two, share it with anybody that you can think of, because we're really trying to make an honest effort to make some noise with this, because I have a belief that the folks in the room that were making these decisions really didn't know the ramifications that it's going to have. At least I hope so. I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt that it was ignorance, not, they know what's going to happen and they're still following through with it. So let's hope so. Okay. One other thing that I just wanted to provide some commentary on, and I think is appropriate for our conversation today, and I'll probably want to get our panelists' feedback on this as well. And that's this idea, and you guys are hearing this all the time here, is, what is, should we forgive some student loan debt? $10,000 and $50,000 seems to be the popular things that Biden, Elizabeth Warren here in our backyard in Massachusetts put something out yesterday of, $50,000 is the number. So I wanted to, we get questions about this a long time. What do you guys think about this? And listen, I think there's a lot of that that's great, right? Forgive $10,000, forgive $50,000. If you all that are smarter than me, that know how to run budgets, can figure out how to make the numbers work behind the scenes, and we can have all these Americans get $10,000 or $50,000 forgiven, great. I understand the upside, and now they can go, put that money back into the economy in other ways. And although I know some people that said, hey, I just made my last student loan payment 30 years ago and I didn't get that break. I understand the downside, but okay, that's fine. If you can make that happen, that's fine. But here's my problem with the whole rhetoric around that. How does that change this whole investment of going off to college and families that are sending their kids to college? What's going to be different 5 years from now? What changed in the system? And like I just mentioned a couple of minutes ago, if anything, the changes are going to make it harder and more expensive for families to send their kids to college. But how does forgiving student loan debt, how's that going to help us moving forward? Why are we not going to be in the same position, but worse 10 years from now? And that does nothing to address that issue, right? And the reason why I bring that up is because you all that are tuning in here today are hopefully part of this mission that's like, okay, this is a problem here. We got to do something better. What's the solution? Which we like to think of, we're at the forefront of, right? And you all listening here today are trying to get educated on, well, how can I help prevent this problem in my community so it is better 10 years later? Because we think we have some strategies that really are aligned with that, right? Whatever happened in the past, that's the deal. Okay, you want to forgive something, great, but how do we prevent this from moving forward and continuing on another generation and so on and so forth, and being exaggerated? So I think that's an important, because nobody's talking about that. I haven't heard one person in the media or anything like that talk about how does that help us moving forward. So I'll get off my soapbox momentarily here at least, but let me introduce the rest of the data accuracy team. And I believe Ryan's joining us now, but we have Brian Ford, who's here, fellow Bostonian here in my neck of the woods. And Brian is somebody that I consider to be really unique in the admissions space in particular, in that one of the few folks that I've met that's been on every side of the fence. He's been in the college world, most recently at Boston University. He's been admissions counselor at a school called Austin Prep, which is one of the more prestigious private colleges in the Boston area, and then in the private practice. So there's really cool, unique perspective. Okay, Lynn O'Shaughnessy, she's out there, and she's got a hard day out there in San Diego today. We learned she's got to drain her hot tub, so she's struggling out there on the West Coast. But she has been someone that I've been a fan from afar for some time, and she has spent her career, and I'll let each of these folks elaborate on themselves, but just to give you a little introduction, but spent a lot of her career just number one as a journalist, specifically with a lot of expertise around this industry, and she has been coached up, I believe, hundreds of advisors and financial professionals around the country that are trying to help folks in their community, and she's been at the top of the food chain there. Brings us to Dr. Mark Salisbury. Mark Salisbury, PhD, representing the Midwest here with his playoff beard. So Mark's been a friend of ours for some time now. Our missions are very much aligned, and that's really trying to bring doing our best to try to bring price transparency to this whole college buying process, right? One of the biggest challenges, Americans, college-bound families don't know what colleges are actually going to cost them, and it's very college intuitive. You know, nobody knows that the $80,000 private college in their backyard is going to be more affordable than the state school, out of state and maybe even in state, right? These are the types of things that we're trying to educate folks with at scale. Mark can talk a little bit further when we kick it over to him about his what his company actually does. He's the CEO and founder of a company called Tuition Fit, which again, we are huge fans of and support what they're doing, and are constantly looking to collaborate with one another. And then Ryan, classic Harvard guy. Ryan's a classic Harvard guy. Ryan is the director of Harvard Medical School. He came right now within the financial lane. We've been doing that for years and years, and we'll continue to do it today. But Brian, I want to get started with you. Okay, I want to get started with you because I know you've and we've been in constant contact about how COVID specifically has impacted the admissions landscape, at various schools across the country. And I know you're seeing some patterns and have a bunch of anecdotes that might be useful. So I want to get your take on that. And then also I'd love to hear what you're seeing, what you've learned from this, with this huge shift to test optional colleges, if you wouldn't mind sharing some things with us there.
Yeah, thanks, Matt, for having me again. Excited to be here, excited to kind of dig in a little bit deeper as we hopefully start to turn a page on what COVID has done to college admissions for sure. But it's been an interesting year. I think it was really this time last year that we kind of spoke as everything was starting to kind of shut down and what would kind of be the short-term and long-term repercussions of this. And we saw this huge test optional movement. And as you said, more than 90% of the schools nationwide went to some form of test optional. Now, I won't get into the different definitions of test optional to test flexible, to test blind, to test recommended. But what we're seeing is essentially schools are re-upping on that. They are right now already 55% of the schools nationwide have already committed to go test optional for next year as well. That includes all 8 Ivy institutions. And I think the other big thing to highlight is the UC, University of California state system, which is the largest state system in the country and kind of dictates how other state systems will run. They've committed to actually going test blind for the next 3 years. And so what they're saying is, we're not even going to look at test scores moving forward. That's obviously a big change when you consider all of their schools, but particularly a school like UC Berkeley or UCLA, which are top 20 schools nationwide, typically have very low admit rates. UCLA receives over 100,000 applications a year and now aren't going to be using test scores as a way to distinguish between those students. So it really changes the model of what is happening. I don't make light of when people lose work in any way, shape, or form, but I think it was pretty telling a few weeks ago when the College Board had to lay off close to 15% of their employees. And the truth of the matter is less kids are taking standardized tests nationwide at the moment. The other kind of big move that the SAT announced is they'll be officially dropping the essay from their test as of June 1st, as well as eliminating SAT subject tests. And where that comes into play is obviously when you think of some of these specialized programs that students apply to, whether it be a BSMD accelerated medical program or other type of medical program, possible 5-year MBA program, where those subject tests originally would have been, if not encouraged, at least, if not required, at least encouraged. Those schools are now going to have to find other ways for students to distinguish themselves. So really the process itself is becoming a little more qualitative than quantitative. And really with the absence of that, or the exception to that, is the transcript of a student is becoming so much more vital. This doesn't mean to say that students are going to stop taking standardized tests. And a bigger issue that we've seen and it kind of goes along with what you were saying regarding financial aid is equity concerns. We're seeing a huge migration of students crossing state lines and even region lines to try to take the SAT or ACT. I work with a number of families in the California areas, and I'm having conversations of whether they should be flying to Las Vegas to take the test, because there are more test centers open in Las Vegas right now than there are in California. The same goes here in Massachusetts. I'm working with families that are willing to drive hours and hours to take the exam if they can try to get an SAT or an ACT test score, despite the fact that they are still applying to schools that are test optional. Fairtest.org, which is a large nonprofit which really looks to celebrate and accentuate the ideas that standardized testing should not be a part of college admissions practices. They are predicting that close to 3 out of every 4 schools will continue to be test optional next year. As I said, right now we're around 55% that have already said they're moving forward. And so it really is the big dictator of how college admissions is being run in the short term, but it's causing a lot of these long-term discussions. Now, the worry is a lot of people have rumors that the University of California is going to just create their own standardized exam, which will lead maybe to not necessarily this standardized exam at all, but these schools creating their own ways of being able to differentiate between students in a quantitative way. But at least as of now, what we're seeing is a large uptick in terms of how students are working with supplemental essays, a large uptick of interviews. Obviously, with the world that we're living in right now, it is technically a lot easier for universities to interview en masse than maybe they would have in past years. That's more for your liberal arts-based schools, smaller based schools. You're not going to see Ivy Leagues do any real official admission interviews. Maybe they'll do some alumni interviews. But what we're seeing is a little bit of what I've been calling kind of the admissions Cold War arms race of students, is students trying to compile any and all type of activities onto their resume that they can. And so we're seeing these volunteer opportunities or these internship opportunities with hundreds to thousands of applicants, because there aren't a lot around there for students to do. And they're also worried about, their sports got canceled or student government isn't happening the way they thought it was. And so how can I look to differentiate myself outside of my transcript? That's the biggest stressor that I'm working with families right now as I work with them. And then just trying to help them highlight themselves within their essays and answer that difficult question of what have you been doing in quarantine that's a little bit different than some other students. There are a lot of larger conversations happening around application numbers, and that nationwide application numbers are down. But when you look at the top 50 schools, application numbers are way up. Part of that is because of them all going test optional, is many kids who maybe otherwise wouldn't have taken a shot decided, hey, maybe I'll take a chance and see if I can get in. Ultimately, many of those students, unfortunately, were most likely not admitted because their GPA or their transcripts still didn't necessarily match up to those students who would have been competitive for Ivy Leagues in the first place. And then the other big thing that we're seeing a worry of for kind of obvious reasons, both from a COVID standpoint, but just from a relations standpoint, is international applicants are way down, both from a standpoint of students coming into the United States, but also from a standpoint of students leaving the United States. And so we're just seeing a lack of difference. And even from a kind of an admission standpoint, schools whose kind of big programs were built around study abroad programs are finding it struggling in a way to kind of remarket some of those programs where maybe, they had this excellent international business program that was really built around going abroad for a year or for a semester. And that's not necessarily a guarantee right now of how that could happen. And so maybe their programs becomes a little less marketable to a student. We're just seeing so many changes in that area. And so it's a real concern. And then even within the United States, migration is way down in terms of students leaving. Historically, where the most students come from are California and the New England area. That also happens to be an area where there are some of the best hospitals in the world. And many families are deciding, why do I want my child to go far away from the best healthcare, considering the world we're living in right now? And so where I would say, New England students I've worked in the past with, maybe their list was 50-50 of Northeast-based schools and then schools around the country. I'd say it's probably closer to 70-30, 80-20 right now. Students just feel a little more comfortable staying close to home right now. And so those state schools in the Midwest and the South that were maybe depending on those Northeast numbers, where there are more high school students right now, they could be in for a troubling year. We won't know till closer to May 1st of kind of where all these numbers are going to fall. And it will be definitely interesting to see how especially large flagships and then some of just the larger private schools react. But right now, there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of not only what are the short-term effects of COVID-19 for college admissions, but particularly when you think about standardized testing, what are the long-term effects and how are students going to be evaluated and differentiated amongst each other moving forward?
Super helpful, Brian. So hopefully everybody learned a lot there in a short window here, and obviously kind of everybody we brought on today. And as a matter of fact, this is our plan. We'll bring them on individually at different points throughout the year to kind of talk specifically in their sweet spot, because as you can imagine, Brian, it can share a whole lot more beyond what he did today. And at least for Brian and Lynn and Mark, everybody's going to have the opportunity to follow up with them when we send a follow-up to this recording with you all that are attending and all those that are at least registered and are not watching live. So you'll have a chance to ping them offline. I mean, we leverage Brian in a whole bunch of different ways. And one of them is what he kind of alluded to say, hey, what are some, I'm not in the admission space, nor do we pretend to be, and I don't think most advisors want to stay away from that with a 100-foot pole. I know that Joe does. But it's great if you can give some value add information to your clients. Say, hey, here's some tips that we got that can help your son, your daughter differentiate themselves. Bring Brian on for a webinar, where you can promote him and his expertise to clients. So these are some different ways that you can leverage what he's all about. So Lynn, I want to kick it over to you, and I'd love for you to expand a little bit on the conversation that we had yesterday, which I thought was pretty cool. I mean, I've had a few of these, but I think everybody needs to hear it. And like you said, especially us snobs up here in the Northeast, and us neurotic folks up here in the Northeast. And this pertains to COVID, non-COVID, FAFSA changes, non-FAFSA changes. This whole idea that, the only successful outcome is if your kid gets into Harvard or Stanford or whatever. So, and I love how you articulate it. So if you would just kind of expand upon that a little bit for us.
Okay, I can talk, and then you can ask me questions. I don't know if I can just, do what Brian did and just rattle all this off, but I can.
That's the admissions experience. It's always.
Whoa, I didn't prepare anything here.
Where's your notes?
Wow, but very impressive, Brian. Okay, you know your stuff. All right, so I guess what I would say, is, parents, I think the kind of clients that people, I mean, if you have a financial advisor, you typically have more money, right? And I think the more people have money, the more their universe of potential colleges shrink, all right, to a tiny little pond instead of like the ocean, right? I mean, they just feel like there's only maybe 24 schools in the country worth going to. And they really don't know a lot about these schools. Like, I bet they couldn't tell you how Dartmouth is different from Yale, right? Very different animals, but they wouldn't even know. It's just, man, it's that brand name and they just got to have it, right? So I think that's a problem because, one, they cost so much money, right? Like Columbia right now is $80,000. I remember when there was a huge stir when George Washington was the first one that crossed 50,000, right? I mean, it just going up and up and up. And, these schools can be great for the very kids that aren't going to those schools, which are lower income, first gen, minority kids. Studies have shown those are the kids who benefit from these fancy schools, right? But the kids who generally go to these schools are extremely rich. In fact, just the other day, Stanford faculty were going, wow, I think we shouldn't we just de-emphasize that you really need to be really rich to go to Stanford, which isn't in their official, admission criteria, but it is true. I mean, you can look at the federal, the federal statistics. And the thing with people who are, high income is they feel they need to go to these schools for the golden ticket, right? They don't understand. They were born into the golden ticket household. They got it already. They got theirs. Let other people have them. They don't need them. The studies are conclusive that kids who come from high income families, I mean, they can go anywhere and typically they're going to do fine. And in fact, there was a big landmark study done a few years ago by Gallup and Purdue that spent a hell of a lot of research time trying to determine what is it that makes a grad that has a bachelor's degree happy in their lives and in their careers. You know, is it the particular kind of school? They did exhaustive research on all this, and they looked at people who had gone to like those elite Northeast schools and flagship schools, regional, non-selective state schools, liberal arts colleges, historically Black art schools, all sorts of, and what they determined was, no, it didn't matter what the school was. What mattered was what you do wherever you show up, wherever you end up. And a lot of it had to do with being at a school where you could get mentoring, right? And you had a professors that encouraged you to do well, that you had an internship or a project that was related to your course of study. That you were really involved in extracurriculars. That's really what mattered. So, you know, I tell people out, you know, families out here in California, I say, you know, it doesn't matter. And, you know, I've given talks up in the Silicon Valley. These people like to hear me talk. And I said, you know, you don't have to go to Stanford up the freeway from where I talk. Your kids can go to San Jose State. They're going to do just fine. They're going to do great, right? So I think for financial advisors, I think that is an important message. I know it's a hard message to give, but it is important because we're talking about a ton of money. You know, if you're talking about one kid at 80,000, right? And you've got 2 or 3 kids, and now because of the FAFSA changes, right? You're not going to be able to, because I used to tell people, well, you know, with one kid, because your income, you're not going to get any need-based aid, even though it's the most elite schools that give the best need-based aid, right? But when you have 2 kids in school, you know, at 80,000 a pop, you could get, some of you are going to qualify for need-based aid. But now that's going to blow up, right? Because for some reason, retired Senator Lamar Alexander decided, well, this isn't fair. Why should, you know, families that have their kids spaced, you know, close together and are going to have kids in at the same time, why should they benefit from families that have their kids spaced 4 years or more apart? I mean, there is an argument to that, but it just seems kind of perverse to hurt all these families out there because of this. So, and the other thing I think is important to know is, and this is one reason why I got into this thing in the first place, because I was a financial journalist. I was at the LA Times. I was a financial journalist for many years, wrote a lot of books about finances. And my daughter, who went to a private high school, girls' high school in San Diego, I mean, it was a school where, you know, my kid's not an A student. You know, most kids aren't, right? She was like, if you stretch it, an A-, stretch it. So she wasn't going to get into Berkeley, where her dad had gone to, you know, his undergrad, or UCLA or any of those. And I was flipping out because I'm like, I don't know where she's going to go. Like, can she get money from other schools, or should I look at private schools? I don't know anything about them. So that's how I got into that. And I realized that, oh my God, she's got plenty of choices. You know, once people get off of the, oh, there's only, you know, a small pond of schools, there are so many schools and are willing to, not only can you get in easily, you know, it's not that hard to get into schools. You do not have to fly to Las Vegas to get your SAT test. You know, most schools would love to have the majority of students, you know. And that's one thing that really pisses me off, is that there's this, especially in the media, like there's this focus like, oh my God, you have to have the best essay, you have to have the best training, you have to, you know what? No, most schools are dying for more kids, and they're going to give your kid money. You know, every year UCLA does a survey of freshmen, undergraduate freshmen, and ask them a bunch of questions. It's a vast survey. And, you know, every year about 75% of kids said they got into their first choice school, right? It's not that hard, people. Now, what the pandemic has done is the elite schools, they're kind of, they're losing some money, but they're operating the way they always have. They have so many applicants, they're never going to have to resort to giving merit aid. They won't. None of these schools give merit aid because they got plenty of wealthy people, plenty. But all the other schools, which is probably 95% of them, 90, they're having to change. A lot of them are having to change because of the pandemic, right? They have to struggle to get these kids. When you look at the statistics about the common application put out of where people were applying, it was this past year, there was a huge increase in the applications to the most selective private schools, not to smaller, less selective private schools or less selective, smaller public schools. So, if you want to see where the bargains are, they're not on the coast and cities, they're like everywhere else. And I think if you need to be smart, and if you realize your kids don't have to go to an $80,000 school, to me, it puts some of the pressure off kids and parents who are going, how the hell are we going to pay for this? Some of these schools today have tremendous discounts. Now, I worry about that too. Then you have to worry about, well, how safe are these schools? But, I look at my son's school. He went to Beloit College in Wisconsin, wonderful liberal arts college. He had a great experience there. I think now Beloit is giving, the tuition is based on where your state flagship, what the tuition is at those Midwestern states. Like, what a deal for a liberal arts education where you're going to have very small classes. You get mentors, which can help you go to grad school. So I'm just saying, I think people need to be smarter about it. And also, I think it's important when you're looking at schools, besides just, stop fishing in that really small pond and stressing yourself out and stressing your kid out, which can cause mental health issues, eating disorders, all sorts of things, is to also know the types of schools out there. Most people don't know what the difference between a college and a research university and a master's level university. That's really important because some kids are going to thrive at different types of schools better than others. So I think people just have to, look at this a little differently. And then also obviously use the tools to be able to know, what kind of price a school is going to be charging you.
Like what type of tools would you say? What if you had to name one? You better say College Aid Pro, by the way.
Well, okay, so College Aid Pro, I think that's great, right? I like College Aid Pro. That's why, I have my online course. Well, I have my own website, but with Horse's Mouth in New York. And that's why we connected with you guys, right? Because you have fabulous software, right? So for everybody, all the people listening who are CAB, well, just use that. But, obviously a no-brainer is a net price calculator, right? You have to use those. And otherwise, people will get, like, I'll give you an example of a relative of mine out here in California, and the kid was wanting, applied to some state schools and then goes, oh, I want to go to NYU, which is on the top 10 most popular schools for California kids to go to is NYU, which because just of its name, right? And it can charge a ton of money. It's one of the only schools that has horrible financial aid and horrible merit aid. That's usually not a combination that you see very often. But anyway, he got into NYU. And I had said, use a net price calculator. Well, in this case, NYU has a horrible calculator. It has the federal one, so it would have been pointless anyway. But the thing is, the kid got in, then he's enamored that, oh, I got to go here, right? NYU. So, the father is paying, over $300,000 for this kid's education. If you have the families use a net price calculator in advance, then you can have a conversation. Hey, if NYU doesn't give us any money, you're not going there.
Right. And that's, and the big, and even so, to your point, a lot, the problem with these net price calculators, number one, they're not all terribly accurate. We're consistently more accurate than they are. And we like to call CAP the instant net price calculator. You don't have to spend 20 minutes, half hour, 45 minutes going to all these different websites. You plug in your information once, put in your 10 schools, and there you go. You know what NYU is going to look like versus Columbia and anything else. But I wanted to unpack a couple other things that you said there. And again, the messaging that these name brand schools isn't the only way to have a successful end result, but nobody really, number one, nobody knows what schools are going to cost them. So that's the first thing you can find out. Where are you going to get discounts, right? And how can we do that efficiently and accurately? I mean, that's kind of the foundation of our software. And number two, something we're really excited about right now, we're working behind the scenes with that hopefully is in the near future. I think it certainly will be by next fall, is more of a focus on the outcomes. Okay. And we have this built in now, but specifically, what is a reasonable investment for the family up front, but what can I expect in a return based on the school I'm graduating from within a certain discipline? What's a reasonable expectation that I'm going to take home as a student? And does this investment make sense? It makes it a lot easier to say, well, I'm not going to do all that research. Just go show me. If I'm just going to be a English major from Beloit and I'm going to pay this price, what can I expect? And again, obviously this is not perfect and life happens, but a really reasonable expectation of is this a good investment, right? What is my a reasonable expectation of a return here? So that's something that we're really, really excited about, where people and advisors in particular don't have to think about that. Just see what the numbers say and let folks go make an educated decision on their own. But I think it's a super important point. And the other thing that you mentioned to me yesterday, if I'm a financial advisor, well, wouldn't I love to show my client, well, here's a similar outcome at $150,000 versus $300,000. Well, now we got $150,000 to play with. Let's go, let's go talk about that. So I want to make sure that we get to Ryan and Mark here as well. So Ryan, I mean, you big timed us, classic Harvard bro, right? So thanks for big timing us here. But I want to make sure that I get some of your feedback. I think most importantly, get some commentary about this. Some of these FAFSA changes, I mean, the ones that you and I have talked about a lot, the biggest one being the sibling one, and any others that you see as being important here, one way or the other, for better or for worse. And I know one of the main things that you've told me so far is that colleges individually, for the most part, haven't really made decisions in terms of how they're actually going to react or maybe not react to this, but just what you're talking about at Harvard and MIT and within your networks of, are you expecting to implement these changes that at least the FAFSA or federal methodology schools are or not? But if we could just talk about that a little bit, curious to get your take as of today.
Sure. So yeah, as Matt said, there really hasn't been any large overreactions to this point. I mean, again, with a few years before these even go into effect, schools are, again, with the time of year right now, they're focused on the incoming 21-22 class first and foremost. And then as far as some of these larger changes, I think the hope is that through advocacy and signing, again, Matt's petition is one step towards that. Like, the largest change is that 2 in school number, because again, every other change is a change within the analysis as opposed to that bottom line 2 in school change. So that would be the largest change. So again, without being able to predict the future, I would say, I think with the adverse reaction that's going to see, that by the time it's meant to go into effect, hopefully will be gone. And then in addition to that, I think even in a world where that doesn't go away, the private schools who are doing their own institutional analysis aren't going to rely upon that decision made by the federal government. So yes, that's it. Again, I think it'll be gone, but even in a worst case scenario where it's not, for the institutional aid, they're still going to be making that 2 in school split. Again, maybe some of the schools who are on the verge of closing and are really struggling with funding will use that as an excuse. But any school, even mid-tier, and certainly the most selective schools, are not going to be using that change. The 2 in school split will still exist. Again, institutional schools aren't doing quite a 50-50 split all the time, but regardless of how they're doing it, whether it's 50-50, 60% or 75% split, that's still going to exist. So I wouldn't think of any overreacting to that. So what I would say is, with that, just stay on top of it, see where that's going, but before completely overreacting to it, give it time to play out. Some of the larger other ones that are in there, with divorce separated families, where it's meant to be which parent gives more financial support, which is certainly a large change, where previously had been where the student lives more, which realistically meant whichever parents kind of had the right to choose. So in divorce separated, that's something to keep an eye out on. The child support and some of the untaxed income changes, I would just look at that, where some of them are no longer counted at all. And like for child support, for instance, it's now treated as an asset, which is weighed far less heavily than income. The business change where that is now on a FAFSA, where that 100 employee rule is removed is another one. Again, assuming these all still go into effect.
Let me pause you right there, because and let me kind of reiterate some of these, because they are, I think, worth emphasizing. So right now, as it currently stands on the FAFSA, if you're a business owner, even if you're a sole proprietor, or you have a larger business, so long as there's less than 100 employees, you don't have to report, you shouldn't report any assets or the net worth of the business, etc. It's 100 employees. Okay, so even if you have 50 employees, pretty big business, you don't have to report anything. But now, even if you're a sole proprietor, that does have to be reported. So that's a significant change. And I remember I was having a conversation, I forget who was with us, somebody out in the Midwest, that was talking about the impacts that's going to have, because this includes farms, right? And where we are in the Northeast, and some more urban areas, we don't really think about that. But I know, Joe, kind of where you grew up, and Mark, where you're out there, that's how plenty of folks are making their living. And so that's a whole nother community that could be severely negatively impacted here. But the other thing, again, even though Ryan said this, I want to make sure that I say it out loud, especially for those of you, because we talked about this yesterday for you CAP advisors, that are talking about, are these changes, the sibling rule in particular, are going to be built into the software? And I made mention of this yesterday, but you heard it from Ryan. He and doesn't have a crystal ball, but his instincts are telling him, and his conversations are telling him, that hopefully this sibling rule doesn't actually go through. And I think part of that, Ryan, is because you think of how ridiculous that is, like it can't go through, right? I mean, that's essentially what you shared with me. In a few conversations we've had around it. But even if it does, the schools like Harvard and these elite type of schools, and in Ryan's words, even the kind of mid-tier private universities, are probably still going to ignore it, okay, and have some type of sibling discount. But again, it gives, for these schools that are probably, especially those that are maybe hurting a little bit, or could use some more resources financially, they now have the ability to maybe, quote unquote, hide behind the federal government's rule, and at least gives them kind of an out to not use the sibling discount or lower it, or whatever it happens to be. So it's something that again, to me, bears worth repeating, but it's a huge unknown, and that's why we don't want to just sit on our hands. That's part of the reason why the petition's out there. But just kind of wanted to reemphasize some of those points, because there's certainly big ones. But sorry to cut you off, but I don't know if you have any thoughts you want to finish here.
So no, and then I guess I would just say, and back to Lynn's point, where the decision was made as, well, why should someone with 2 in school get a break that someone where they would happen to be spread apart a bit further not get it? To me, the idea to take away the benefit then makes no sense. The argument, in my opinion, should be, well, then there should be some additional break given for someone who happened to have them more spread out, versus taking away the logical break that currently exists for 2 at the same time. So I do think that will eventually head more in that direction. And then just, again, keeping an eye on, as far as any publications you have. I think the terminology changes in some of these, with the main one being the EFC, the largest terminology change, but just even within some of the analysis. So keep an eye on that for any publications you have for clients. I know, again, the College Aid Pro stuff would be all taken care of for you, but anything that you market on your own, that terminology is just something to look out for.
You guys started that? Have you started that lift at Harvard yet? In terms of, so what Ryan's saying, there's right now, everybody talks about EFC, expected family contribution. That's a big buzzword, acronym, et cetera. That's going away, and it's going to be SAI, the Student Aid Index. So we're among them that's going to have to do a lot of homework in terms of switching around that terminology. So
yeah, so we haven't started just because it's, again, so far off, but that's one that schools, if that stays the standard terminology, schools will, I think, even on their institutional side, switch as well for the simplification for families. And then again, just other than the legislative changes, I just wanted to quickly touch on, again, for client purposes, the fact that with financial aid being based on the prior year, the default tax return for this year is still going to be 2019. So keep in mind, any potential change in 2020 as a result of COVID would take that extra step of reaching out to the school and saying that 2019 is no longer representative of the family's income. And so just that extra bit of communication pushing for 2020 income. So I think it's a nice luxury where if 2020 did go up, you don't have to say anything and take the benefit of using 2019 information. But if it did go down, just keep in mind that would take that extra step of reaching out to the school and working with them on whatever their varied policy might be.
Yeah, it's great feedback.
I'm just going to quickly say, because I do have to step out, but I wanted to say from kind of the admissions perspective of what I've seen since the potential ruling regarding siblings has come in is kind of similar opinion to what happened when the Coalition app kind of came into the seams 4 or 5 years ago. Essentially, is this going to further the divide between kind of the mighty and then the smaller schools that unfortunately we're seeing close throughout the country, which I think Lynn brought up good points, are a necessary entity of higher education and are a good fit for certain students. And so we're getting into this worrisome position where schools that can't afford to still give that discount, should it go into effect, will almost use it as a marketing tool. And then there are some schools that might have no choice but to follow that new adherence, especially not knowing what their financial outlook is going to look like post-pandemic, just to stay alive and stay afloat. And so now you could have even of a further of the divide where, you know, the big idea around the Coalition was you could only join the Coalition application if you were a school that met full need. And so it really kind of put schools into two different camps. You know, the Coalition hasn't shot off the way I think many people thought it would, but this ruling now has some admissions professionals worried that maybe work for those smaller liberal arts schools that really fit a really nice niche. I think particularly up here, when we think up here in the Northeast, of all of those schools that really are a good home for a certain amount of students, particularly students maybe with learning differences. Those schools are slowly going away, and this could further put some of those schools at risk.
No, it's great feedback. And Brian, I know you got to jump, so do your thing whenever. And like I said, in the follow-ups, we'll make sure that folks that want to reach out to Brian have the opportunity to do so. I want to make sure I get Mark's input on some stuff. But before I get to Mark, an important point that Ryan just brought up, and we're going to do a webinar on this topic in and of itself, but that's how appealing for additional financial aid consideration or maybe merit consideration with colleges. And the takeaway was, if 2019 was a completely different reality in 2020, make sure you get those 2020 tax returns to bring to colleges' attention and document that to try to get more money than maybe you got initially. If 2020 was better, maybe keep that to yourself. Those are Ryan's words, not mine. So, but we'll talk about that, and maybe we'll pick Ryan's brain for some of his institutional insight when we have a date on the calendar there. But Mark has the unique opportunity, similar to what we have in seeing thousands of different financial aid award letters from around the country at all these different colleges. So again, trying to bring that price transparency to families. And what I wanted to do, Mark, is get your take on any kind of general, whether it's changes or insights, or, you know, what have you seen this year, specifically as it pertains to COVID, if there has been a difference, whether that's at particular schools or types of schools, or things that have got a little bit better or worse, or what are some takeaways that you're seeing, at least so far? I know we got a ways to go this year, but you know, have you formed any general opinions to date on that front?
Me forming general opinions, I've no idea what we're talking about.
And by the way, Mark, sorry, before you get going, some people will be leaving us at 3, and I know we didn't leave you too much time here. I promise that wasn't by design, but just so you're aware, and we want to make sure that we do at least have some closure around 3 o'clock, and then we will stick around, at least Joe and I, for a bit afterwards for questions. You guys are welcome to stay with us, of course, as well. But
yeah, no, you're right. Tuition Fit's built on the idea that, you know, there's sort of 2 phases where you really need to have some knowledge about what's going on. One is way early in the process, so that your list of schools really is a set of schools that fit your financial fit your financial needs, your price range. But then Lynn was mentioning this earlier, and even prior to COVID, you surveyed colleges and universities, you find out that 7 and 10 aren't making their enrollment numbers in September. Forget about May 1st, in September. And what that's leading to, and it's been leading this way for a decade, is colleges and universities, yes, they use the old language of appeal, but the reality is most of them are more than willing to negotiate. And when they send out their first financial aid offer, that's not actually the best price you can get. Right. So there's two times in which you really need to be able to have some financial context. So one is early, so that you ensure that the schools that you're applying to are actually going to be schools that you can consider. You don't get an application accepted, an award letter that's 5 times more than you're willing to pay. The other time is then at that second phase near the end, where now you've got some award letters and you don't want to just sit there and then accept whatever somebody gives you. You want to make a phone call. You want to find a way to see if you can negotiate yourself a better price. And in order to do that well, you need to know what else is going on. So the Tuition Fit project was essentially about crowdsourcing the actual data and the actual award letters so that people can see the information for themselves, and especially for financial advisors who are providing value to their clients by helping them save money on college every which way they can. Here's a great place to do that. Now, you asked me about what are we seeing so far? Well, one, and Brian mentioned this earlier, there was this huge surge of applications to the really selective schools, which, by the way, with every one of those applications came a nice little $100 check.
Right.
Every one of those schools had this wonderful windfall of extra revenue in their admissions process. They didn't accept more students. They didn't get bigger. They just said, great, thank you for the money. Appreciate it. Meanwhile, all the schools that were sort of off the radar, they're not getting nearly as many applications. So essentially, this whole process has created an even bigger divide between the haves and the have-nots in higher education. So yay us for that. The other thing that we're seeing is a lot of schools, now all of a sudden, they have to look deeper at the transcript. They're trying to look at essays. They're looking at other things because they didn't have test scores from most of their applicants. And that's just put them behind in getting out decisions. So there's a whole lot of schools that would have had decisions out by now that they still haven't gotten them out. And so everything's getting pushed back. And that's going to make this next phase of the cycle really interesting, right? May 1st is already less important for schools than it used to be, just because they don't get enough students and they're still having to scramble to get them into the end of May and June. Now the decisions are coming out later. The number of students that schools admitted in early decision didn't necessarily go through the roof either. And so those admit rates were way down. All of this is just kicking this can down the road to what I think might end up being a real free-for-all when we get to April, May, June, and even July and August. I think we're going to see all kinds of stuff going on there, because a lot of folks are still reasonably concerned about, I don't want to go to school from my bedroom in my pajamas and pay a bunch of money to do it again. Right. So let's wait and see. You know, if it's just going to be taking it online, then I'll do it from the local community college. So as far as the prices we've seen so far, we've seen some really interesting change. We've seen some really interesting movement in schools that are sort of that Ivy adjacent category, where they're the ones that are across the street from the fancy country club and therefore claim they're part of the country club. And there's some really nice offers coming out of those schools. But we're also seeing a whole bunch of offers that don't look any different than they did a year ago. Mm-hmm. And those are oftentimes either the school that doesn't have to because they got 100,000 applications, or they're schools that they got no more margin to cut from. They're the schools that are like a lot of the mom and pop restaurants out there. The margin's nothing and you're only doing one thing. You don't have any place to cut from. Mm-hmm. So in general, I don't think we're going to see a huge change in average price overall, but we're seeing a lot of musical chairs within that. And of course, the problem for everybody is that every individual family just sees a very tiny slice of all that movement, but doesn't see the whole thing. And so they don't know what to think. And that's why Tuition Fit is becoming a really valuable tool for a lot of folks right now.
I agree.
Mark, I want to just stress that, like, I think the great analogy you use is the idea of a Kelley Blue Book value. What are other families paying, and can you find a red one instead of a green one that has the same stuff and get it for a more affordable price? I mean, that's the whole, I love that analogy of what you're doing at Tuition Fit. So
thanks. I mean, and that's really the idea. Lynn was talking about it earlier. Everything we know from 40 years of research on college students, and anybody out there who knows a little bit of my background, who does a little bit of LinkedIn stalking, can see that I've spent most of my career studying how college works and when it doesn't work, why, and studying how college students succeed or don't succeed and as a function of what. And 40 years of data says the same thing, is the school that you go to, that name of that school, it matters for a very thin slice of students. And it's the students for whom they came from a context that is the polar opposite of the context of that institution, right? That homeless minority kid who also happens to be a genius, right? Everybody else, it's what you do while you're there that drives the train. And then the farther away you get from graduation, the less and less it matters. So at some point, for most of us, you're paying for a college degree, you're paying for that credential. And then you earn your cred as a person based on how much you grew and how much you learned and what kind of skills you developed in that period of time that you were in college, that frankly, you might not have developed as a function of the college experience at all. You might have spent the summer canvassing for a political campaign and you learned a ton about other stuff. The college doesn't get credit for that, but that you did that during that 4-year stretch, right? Yeah. So when you put it that way, it really matters then to be able to, as you just said, Joe, have a way to compare value. We're all talking about what's the ROI from college. And we've got some pretty useful ways to calculate the R, the return, right? But the I is what matters, because you can't calculate the formula unless you have both the R and the I. And what that I ends up being for a family or anybody who's helping students through the process starts by making sure that you've got a smart list of schools, and everybody here has contributed to that part of the conversation in really smart ways. And then it matters at the late stages how much you can drive whatever price you ultimately pay down, because you can really do that at most institutions.
Yeah, I mean, you can't hear that messaging enough. I mean, we all need the reinforcement, and my hope is that for folks that is being validated. I mean, these are quite literally who we seek out as the experts in this industry. This isn't one person's opinion. I mean, these are folks that have been doing it their whole career, and this is what they've seen. They've seen the beginning and the end, and this whole process many times over. So I'm hoping that messaging resonates and you can help spread that message in your communities. Now, I popped in anybody that wants to learn more about us, College Aid Pro. If you haven't seen our software yet, I just put a link in the a link in the chat section there. So if you want to get a little bit further into us, we're happy to answer any follow-up questions. Everybody's going to get this recording along with the contact information of our panelists, our data accuracy team as well. Ryan, I'll talk to you about that. You might not be included in that piece, but at least Lynn and Mark, to learn more about them and their businesses, and Brian, I know they'll be happy to talk with folks that want to learn more. And again, you have the ability to see how we incorporate all this into a software where we threw a ton of information at you in an hour, right? The idea is not everybody has to be experts. We're trying to build that into the technology itself, where you just get a couple sets of data from the family, or they put it in themselves, and then they have some outputs and they're off and running, or you all are off and running. That's the idea, right? That's how Joe and I kind of got started on this thing, and the rest of our team is, how do we take all this knowledge and make it instantaneous for everybody else and bring net price calculators to one place and that whole deal.
Yeah, Matt, you may bring up a great point. I'll just interject a couple things as we come to a close for the advisors on here. If you're not hearing it come through loud and clear, it's disruption. There is a ton of change going on with college funding, and parents are scared, they're freaked out, they're stressed out, and they're anxious. And if you're a financial planner, the opportunity for us these days is behavioral. It's helping people lower their shoulders, reduce stress and anxiety, and there's nothing more anxiety producing than this particular topic. So if you're not yet well versed, College Aid Pro is a solution that we've developed to help you deliver this advice with confidence and ease and proactively instead of reactively. The worst thing that happens with college is if you get in, we'll figure it out. That's the problem with the whole process. We let our young kids shop for Bentleys, Rolls Royces, and Lamborghinis, and they should be looking at Camrys and Accords, right? And the other piece is it's all about net price. You know, the low income inner city kids. So just these simple things, if you're not yet on board with this, and I think it was about 50-50 today, you know, this is a way to really help provide a solution, but do it with confidence and ease, you know, and utilize our resources and our backstop. So, you know, as all these things, all these great things we talked about today, if you felt like you were drinking from a fire hose, imagine you're a parent and you're not a financial planner. Put yourself in those shoes. So I just want to put some context there. We've got some good questions, but I just kind of wanted to pull that together because I'm sitting here going, man, if I'm an advisor, this is intimidating, but man, what if you're a parent, you know, that's a teacher and a firefighter? I mean, you know, like, so these are the kind of people we want to get this message out to, and we need everybody as a community to help us do that. So I think if we want to close on that, I'm happy to stick around for questions, as you said. And I don't know if we have a ton that come in, but I think you know, we are up on time, but I can stick around for a few questions, and if anybody else has parting thoughts.
Well, I want to thank Lynn, Mark, Ryan, and Brian for coming on and kind of being a part of our mission here. I mean, and I thought it was awesome to get each of your messaging, and an hour truly probably doesn't do it enough justice. But like I kind of teased here, we don't have dates on the calendar yet, but what we want to do is get with each one of these folks individually, kind of give them the stage for a whole hour so we can focus in and on their sweet spot, and do that with some regular cadence. I mean, I think our hope is to do this pretty consistently in some capacity, but this is kind of our first go at it because there's a lot happening right now, specifically in you know, in the media. We're hearing all sorts of different things every day. So it's like, all right, let's really get the folks that are in the know in the same room and disseminate that information, how it's impacting everybody, and how can we use it to help out. So thank you guys for joining us. And Joe, if there's any questions that you think we should hit on before we cut out, happy to. Otherwise, Lynn, Mark, Ryan, if you got anything to add, feel free to chime in. Otherwise, you guys cut off whenever you feel like it. And thank you again for carving out an hour for us.
Yeah, I do think somebody just asked a question, and I think it's important that even though the changes, you know, for the formula will be for the 23-24 school year, that's going to rely on the 2021 tax return. So you can't just, for people this will affect, particularly, you know, divorced and separated families, it's going to matter this year what they do.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, you know, and businesses too.
Yep. Yeah,
so
Ryan,
that's just something I think people need to be aware of.
Yeah, Ryan, I would love your perspective on this too, because one of the things that I'm trying to tell coach clients on is we got to be proactive, because if we're looking at award letters and we were planning for this overlap, if you've got a freshman, you know, you have a senior now, a freshman, and they've got one behind them, you know, we're trying to plan for that. So we're trying to say, hey, you know, we need some assurances. Like, we're trying to say we might get a discount, you know, at a school using the CSS profile, but there's just so much in the air. I don't know how to give great guidance there, other than can we get assurances from the school themselves?
Yeah, I would think, especially for anyone entering this year, where the thought is, okay, they're an only child in school now, but in their junior year, when this would go into effect, is when you planned on getting that break. Or even if you have twins and you wanted the break for all 4 years, and you're wondering what's going to happen in years 3 and 4, would just be communicating with that school. I think, again, the answer is going to be that they're not going to have a direct answer now. My guess is, though, every school at the very least is going to have some sort of like grandfathering of the students who are accepted now. I mean, you can't realistically have that especially where if you're talking twins, where they're getting this huge break, and then in years 3 and 4 see this drop off. But yeah, it's just a matter of communicating and seeing what type of assurance the schools will give. But one, I don't think it's going to be as big an impact at all. And second, I think there has to be some sort of grandfathering in of the students entering now.
Got it. And there was another interesting question here from my good friend Vanessa. Read something about a change regarding grandparent gifts and how the grandparent resources are going to come into this. I don't know who wants to take this one, but I don't know if that.
You have insight on that, Ryan? Did you see that at all?
No, so I don't, Lynn, you were shaking your head. I don't know if you
Well,
wanted
yeah.
to.
So, I mean, basically before, this was a big deal, right? Like how grandparents can help without messing up need-based aid, right? And you had to it wasn't the easiest thing. As long as grandparents saved for college was fine. It was when they they took the money out, right? And so we've told people, under the current rule, well, as long as if you wait until a child's second semester of sophomore year and to give them money, it won't show up because you use 2-year-old tax returns. And kids are supposed to, though how many do? If a grandparent gives money to pay for college, that's supposed to be a kid's untaxed income. And that's supposed to be on the kid's income tax return. How many times is that even put on a kid's income tax return? Probably very rare, but that's the rules, right? So now they're saying that they're not going to ask anymore about grandparents, aunts and uncles, godparents, whatever. Are you giving money? Did you give money to this kid for college, right? So now it's not going to be an issue, right?
Yeah,
I mean, the last year is going to be an issue would be, so by 2023, you would be using 2021 taxes, right? So this year, it's not going to be an issue. So you can give money to, grandparents now can give money, but that's just the FAFSA. On the other hand, the profile cares about this.
Yeah.
So if you're just going to a FAFSA school, you're like, grandparents can just, give money now for a FAFSA only school, but what are the profile schools going to do? My guess would be Brian might have a better idea of this. My guess is they're still going to want to know.
Yeah, I think that's not going to change. I think it is still going to be a profile question asked and received by the schools. I think, again, in talking with clients, the biggest difference is just making sure it's not in the student's name is the biggest, because you're talking about a 20% assessment rate versus a parent, which again, it's a fluctuating scale, but let's say roughly 5% of assets go towards a parent contribution versus 20% of the student contribution. In the grandparents, so even if it's counted, most schools are still going to count it at that parent rate. So the biggest answer to that is just don't have it in the student's name, have it in the parent's name. And again, that's not a matter of like tricking the schools. It's just, again, that most of those assets, they are realistically not the students, even if put in their names. So just keep it in the parent name for the benefit of.
Yep. Yeah, it'll be interesting. There's this, I think the divide between the institutional method and the federal method is getting wider, is what I'm finding here. Because, they're trying to throw this blanket. Now they're creating new technology. One anecdote I heard is they changed it to the student aid index because parents were offended and hurt that it was an expected family contribution, as if they hadn't done enough. And I was like, well, you haven't. We get questions all the time. I'm not helping my kids pay for college. And I was like, well, maybe you should. Or help them make a smart choice at least. We're not going to help you, so go to community college.
Right.
I don't know.
All right, everybody.
Board?
I'm sorry?
We clear the board?
Yeah, I feel like this was a success. I'm going to count as a success, right? So hopefully everybody had a similar experience. And Lynn, thanks for keeping us on our toes with the early start there today. That was good.
Sorry about that. I hit the wrong button.
You're good. I know. Listen, you're all good. You're all good. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it a little bit. I hope everybody gets some good feedback. And again, I appreciate it. And everybody have a great rest of the day.
Cheers.
Take care, y'all.
Guys.